For years, Kaliningrad was marketed as Moscow's loaded gun pointed straight at Europe, a place designed to scare, pressure, and intimidate. Russian television called it an unsinkable fortress, a military dagger pressed into NATO's side. But that image was always fragile, because it depended on access that Russia never truly controlled. Kaliningrad was never connected to the mainland by its own land. It survived only because others allowed it to breathe. Once Poland and Lithuania stopped pretending and began acting on pure security logic, the illusion collapsed fast. What looked like strength turned out to be exposure. What Moscow framed as leverage became a choke point. Geography did not change, but power over geography did. And when that shifted, Kaliningrad stopped being a threat and started becoming a liability Moscow could not rescue. The collapse began quietly but brutally with the disappearance of road access. Trucks that once crossed borders daily suddenly faced inspections that went nowhere and rules that changed by the hour. Lines stretched for miles. Drivers slept in their cabs for days and then were told to turn around. Transport companies went bankrupt almost instantly. Vehicles were parked, sold, or dismantled. Thousands lost their income without warning. This was not a temporary disruption. This was the removal of the region's main artery. Without roads, Kaliningrad lost speed, flexibility, and volume. Goods that once arrived cheaply and regularly stopped coming at all. The message was clear and unmistakable. The land bridge was gone, and it was not coming back. Rail was supposed to be the backup, but it collapsed even faster. Lithuania enforced sanctions with precision, blocking entire categories of goods deemed strategic. Trains carrying cement, steel, coal, and industrial components were stopped cold. This instantly paralyzed construction, manufacturing, and energy supply chains. Factories ran out of inputs and shut their doors. Projects froze mid-build and were abandoned to rust and rain. The industrial heartbeat of the region slowed, then flatlined. Moscow protested loudly, but protests did not move trains. Each idle railcar became proof that Russia had lost control of its own enclave. Kaliningrad was no longer supplied by schedule, only by exception, and exceptions do not sustain economies. With land and rail effectively dead, the Kremlin clung to the sea as its last hope and sold it to the public as a solution. Officials claimed everything could be shipped, that the Baltic would replace roads and rails. In reality, the sea exposed Russia's weakness even more clearly. There were not enough ships, ports lacked capacity, loading and unloading took too long. Transport costs exploded overnight. What once took days now took weeks. What once was affordable became absurdly expensive. Food spoiled before arrival. Industrial deliveries missed deadlines and shut down production lines. Every extra day at sea meant higher prices on store shelves. Inflation surged faster than wages could react, and ordinary families absorbed the damage first. As the logistics system collapsed, the social fabric followed. Unemployment surged across transport, manufacturing, warehousing, and support services. Entire professions disappeared almost overnight. Official figures showed a shocking rise in joblessness. But locals knew the real numbers were worse. 1 in 5 workers suddenly found themselves without income in a region with nowhere to escape. Anger replaced patience. Fear replaced pride. Kaliningrad's people felt abandoned, trapped between NATO borders and a mainland that could not reach them. The region's reputation as Russia's European window shattered, replaced by a sense of siege and isolation. By the time the Baltic Sea began to feel less like a route and more like a wall, it was already clear that Kaliningrad was no longer a power center. It was a hostage. The moment Finland and Sweden entered NATO, the Baltic Sea stopped being neutral space and turned into hostile geometry for Moscow. What Russian planners feared for decades became reality without a single shot fired. The sea surrounding Kaliningrad was no longer a buffer, but a cage. NATO now controlled every meaningful access point, from the Danish Straits to the northern and southern corridors. Surveillance blanketed the water. Russian ships moving toward Kaliningrad were forced to sail through narrow lanes watched from air, land, and sea. This meant that the so-called maritime lifeline could be cut instantly, mined overnight, or blocked under the justification of security operations. The Baltic Fleet, once portrayed as dominant, was reduced to a trapped force tied to port infrastructure it could not abandon. Kaliningrad's last supply route existed only at NATO's tolerance, not Russia's command. Poland and Lithuania understood this shift perfectly and stopped hiding their intent behind diplomatic language. Warsaw made it clear that Kaliningrad was no longer viewed as a distant outpost, but as an active threat zone that would be neutralized if necessary. Statements about burning everything within 300 kilometers were not rhetoric meant for television. They were deterrence messages designed to leave no ambiguity. Lithuania reinforced this pressure by openly discussing the complete shutdown of transit on national security grounds. This was not an embargo discussion anymore. It was a countdown scenario. Moscow's long-standing threat to seize the Suwalki Corridor collapsed under this reversal. The message was simple. Any aggression would be answered by sealing Kaliningrad completely and leaving it exposed, isolated, and undefended. At the same time, NATO's military posture hardened on the ground. Germany began deploying troops and heavy equipment eastward as part of Poland's defensive shield, a move loaded with historical weight and modern intent. Tanks, armored vehicles, and engineering units appeared near the Kaliningrad border. Trenches were dug, barbed wire was laid, anti-tank obstacles rose from the soil. This was not a temporary exercise, it was permanent preparation. Berlin no longer treated Kaliningrad as a diplomatic complication, but as a frontline risk. The border began transforming into a modern fortress line, dense, layered, and unforgiving. Every kilometer reinforced the same conclusion. NATO was preparing either to repel an attack or to lock the enclave down completely. Inside Russian military planning rooms, the reality was already acknowledged. Simulations showed the same outcome again and again. In any direct conflict, Kaliningrad's connections would be severed within hours, airspace would be closed, reinforcements would never arrive. Ammunition stocks would shrink rapidly, fuel would disappear. The forces stationed there would be isolated and eventually neutralized. Worse still for Moscow, many elite units and advanced systems once assigned to Kaliningrad had already been withdrawn to support the war in Ukraine. Some never returned, some were destroyed. The fortress was hollowed out to feed another front, leaving behind weaker defenses and fewer options. The armor was thinner, the shield was cracked. For the civilians living inside this tightening ring, the danger stopped feeling theoretical. Empty streets, rising prices, and constant military movement created a permanent state of anxiety. Television spoke of strength and control, but daily life told a different story. Jobs vanished, savings evaporated. Children grew up surrounded by uncertainty. The sense of being trapped inside a future battlefield settled into the public consciousness. People no longer discussed whether something would happen, but when. By the time rumors of evacuation and relocation began spreading quietly through neighborhoods and workplaces, the psychological collapse was already complete. The economic collapse quickly turned into something far more dangerous: panic. Once people realized that jobs were not coming back and supply chains were not being restored, behavior changed overnight. Families stopped planning long-term and started planning exits. Apartments went up for sale at cut prices. Personal belongings were packed quietly, often at night. Those who still had savings rushed to convert them into mobility, not comfort. Tickets out of the region became more valuable than property inside it. Kaliningrad's population understood something Moscow refused to say out loud. When a place becomes strategically expendable, the people living there become expendable too. The scale of the exodus was impossible to hide locally, even if official statistics tried. Entire neighborhoods thinned out. Schools lost students. Workplaces lost skilled staff and never replaced them. Sociological surveys revealed that at least 1 in 5 adults had a close family member who had already left or was actively preparing to leave. Independent estimates suggested that between 50,000 people would leave the region between 2022 and 2025. For a population of roughly 1 million, that meant up to 15% gone in just 3 years. That is not normal migration. That is demographic collapse. Once this threshold is crossed, recovery becomes nearly impossible. What made the situation even worse was who was leaving. This was not a random cross-section of society. The people escaping first were young, educated, multilingual, and professionally mobile. Engineers, IT specialists, technicians, and skilled industrial workers disappeared fastest. These were the very people needed to rebuild an isolated economy under pressure. Their departure hollowed out the future, leaving behind an aging population with fewer skills, lower productivity, and greater dependency. This brain drain accelerated decline in a brutal feedback loop. As talent left, opportunities shrank. As opportunities shrank, more people left. The destinations chosen by those fleeing added a layer of humiliation to the crisis. Poland, Lithuania, and Germany became primary targets, the same countries Moscow labeled as hostile and threatening. Russian citizens from Kaliningrad were seeking safety, work, and stability inside NATO states. This was not ideology. It was survival logic. People went where borders were predictable, jobs existed, and war felt distant. Every family that crossed westward carried with it a silent verdict on the Kremlin's Baltic strategy. If Kaliningrad was supposed to be Russia's European showcase, it had instead become proof that Moscow could not protect or sustain its most European population. Faced with this reality, the Kremlin chose denial. Population statistics quietly disappeared from public release. Birth and death data stopped being published regularly. The narrative shifted to silence. But silence does not refill cities or reopen factories. It only deepens mistrust. Locals saw through the absence of numbers and understood its meaning. When a state stops counting people, it has already lost them. Kaliningrad's social structure began to fracture under the weight of unemployment, fear, and abandonment. The region was no longer just isolated geographically. It was isolated politically, economically, and emotionally from the mainland it depended on. Kaliningrad's collapse cannot be explained only through sanctions or military pressure, because at its core, this is a crisis of identity that has finally reached a breaking point. The region has always lived inside a contradiction, geographically planted in Europe while politically chained to Moscow. For years, this tension was survivable because borders were open enough to blur the divide. People worked, traveled, traded, and imagined futures that felt connected to the Baltic world around. That illusion has now been destroyed piece by piece. Borders hardened, movement vanished, and the region was sealed into a political reality it never fully accepted. What remains is a population trapped inside a system that no longer fits its geography, culture, or economic logic. Unlike the rest of Russia, Kaliningrad was never psychologically distant from Europe. Western brands, lifestyles, and norms were part of daily life, not symbols of hostility. This difference once made the region valuable to Moscow, proof that Russia could present a European face when it wanted to. Now that difference has turned into a liability. As isolation deepens, local residents increasingly question why they should pay the price for decisions made far away by leaders who cannot even guarantee their basic stability. This questioning is quiet but corrosive. It does not erupt in protests, but it dissolves loyalty from the inside, leaving behind a hollow attachment to a state that feels abstract and unreachable. The West recognized this fracture and applied pressure with patience rather than spectacle. There was no rush to escalate, no dramatic confrontation needed. Every closed route, every delayed shipment, every stalled factory slowly reinforced the same message. Kaliningrad is expendable. This was not punishment aimed at civilians, but strategic reality imposed through systems Russia could not override. Time itself became the weapon. Each month of isolation weakened economic resilience, social cohesion, and political faith. Moscow could shout, threaten, and deny, but it could not reverse the structural damage unfolding in silence. Once portrayed as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, the enclave now resembles a stranded outpost with no strategic depth. Missiles and radar installations mean nothing when fuel deliveries are uncertain and troop rotations are impossible. Military power without logistics is illusion, and Kaliningrad's illusion collapsed the moment its supply chains failed. Russian planners understand this well, even if officials refuse to say it publicly. The region can no longer support sustained military operations, nor can it be reliably defended in a crisis. It survives on tolerance, not strength, and tolerance is not something states can enforce. The Baltic Sea, once imagined as a secure highway, has completed its transformation into a barrier. With NATO controlling its entrances, airspace, Russian vessels move only under observation and constraint. Any escalation risks immediate isolation of Kaliningrad, turning the sea route into a liability instead of a lifeline. This strips Moscow of initiative and forces restraint it never intended to accept. The sea does not need to be closed permanently to be effective. The mere knowledge that it can be closed at any moment is enough to neutralize strategic freedom. Poland and Lithuania no longer disguise their position behind ambiguity. Their messaging is deliberate, coordinated, and unmistakable. Kaliningrad's survival depends entirely on Russian restraint. Any attempt at coercion or escalation will be answered not with negotiation but with closure. This clarity removes room for miscalculation. The enclave has become a pressure valve aimed inward, not outward. The threat no longer flows from Kaliningrad toward Europe. It flows from Europe toward Kaliningrad, quietly but relentlessly. Germany's posture completes this encirclement. The deployment of troops, armor, and defensive infrastructure near the border is not symbolic theater. And fortified positions are built for scenarios planners expect, not ones they dismiss. This is long-term preparation, not temporary signaling. The border is turning into a modern fortified line, dense and unforgiving. Every kilometer reinforced sends the same message to Moscow. Kaliningrad is considered an active risk zone, and NATO is prepared to seal it off completely if necessary. Inside the region, daily life reflects this reality with brutal clarity. Conversations are dominated by prices, shortages, and exit plans. Parents worry about raising children in a place where stability no longer exists. Young people see no future worth investing in. Even those who remain loyal feel exhausted by uncertainty. A society cannot function indefinitely under the expectation of disaster. Over time, fear stops motivating resilience and starts producing resignation. That emotional collapse is as destructive as any economic sanction. The Kremlin's response has been silence. Population statistics quietly vanished. Birth and death data stopped appearing regularly. This absence speaks louder than any admission. When a state stops counting people, it signals that it has already lost control of the narrative. Kaliningraders understand this instinctively. The disappearance of numbers confirms what they already feel. They are no longer a priority. They are a problem being postponed, not solved. The longer this condition persists, the more irreversible it becomes. Businesses do not return to regions defined by instability. Skilled workers do not raise families in places without futures. Once a critical mass leaves, the social ecosystem collapses rapidly. Schools lose students, hospitals lose staff, and public services deteriorate. Recovery requires confidence, and confidence cannot exist without trust. In Kaliningrad, trust has already been broken beyond easy repair. From a strategic perspective, the enclave has lost its original purpose. It cannot intimidate NATO, cannot anchor offensive operations, and cannot be sustained under pressure. What remains is a symbolic burden that drains resources while offering diminishing return. Every effort to maintain it consumes political and economic capital that produces no strategic advantage. This is the definition of a failed asset. For NATO, the outcome is clear and devastating in its simplicity. Without firing a single shot, one of Russia's most threatening positions has been neutralized. Geography, alliances, and economics achieved what military confrontation did not. This is modern containment executed through patience rather than force. For Russia, the lesson is harsh. Expansion without integration creates traps. Military power without logistics collapses under pressure. Control based on fear fails when fear turns inward. Kaliningrad embodies all of these failures at once. The people living there are paying the highest price. They did not choose this role, yet they are trapped inside it. Their lives have become collateral damage in a strategic contest they cannot influence. That reality breeds bitterness, but also fatigue. Fatigue is dangerous for centralized systems because it does not explode. It erodes. It weakens obedience, loyalty, and belief quietly, day by day. Kaliningrad demonstrates how fatigue spreads faster than propaganda. As time passes, Moscow's options shrink further. Evacuation would signal defeat. Reinforcement risks escalation. Doing nothing accelerates decay. Every path leads to loss. This is strategic paralysis. Kaliningrad's fall is not marked by battle or surrender. It is marked by abandonment. No flags lowered, no declarations signed, just silence, departure, and decay. The enclave that once terrified Europe now survives only because Europe allows it to. That reversal defines the entire crisis. Power changed hands without violence, and the result is final. Kaliningrad has not been conquered. It has been isolated, neutralized, and emptied. In modern geopolitics, that is often worse. Beyond logistics and politics, Kaliningrad is also facing an energy transformation that has left it even more isolated from Moscow. In early 2025, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia fully disconnected their electricity systems from Russia's grid and joined the continental European network, leaving Kaliningrad's power grid islanded and dependent on its own generation capacity rather than connection to the wider Russian system. For decades, the Baltic states worked to end their dependence on Russian energy as a strategic priority, installing modern infrastructure and tapping into European grids and supplies. That shift means Kaliningrad cannot easily import power from Russia through the EU states it borders, even though Baltic nations maintain independent grids without Moscow's control. The result is that Kaliningrad must manage energy scarcity even in everyday life, and its isolation is now electrical as well as geographical, intensifying the hardship ordinary people face and deepening the sense that the enclave is cut off from the country it is supposed to belong to. The region's economic resilience was already weak, and this isolation exposed deeper structural problems that go beyond sanctions. Before the crisis, Kaliningrad's economy relied partly on special tax breaks and a special economic zone status designed to attract investment and offset its isolation. Industries there produced goods like electronics, automobiles, and amber products, and the region's ice-free port was meant to be an asset. But without reliable land transit, investment dries up, trade corridors shrink, and the incentives that once drew business now matter less than the lack of predictable supply and export routes. According to regional economic analyses, Kaliningrad's gross regional product fell in the early years after the war's escalation, and while personal incomes surged briefly due to federal subsidies, the longer-term trend shows vulnerability rather than strength. This exposes a tough truth. The economic tools Moscow used to prop up Kaliningrad are no longer enough when its geography has turned against it more completely than ever before.